Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. This is Nicole with Topaz, and I'm very excited to welcome back Hal Schmitt. Hey Hal.
Hi Nicole.
Thanks for being here. Today Hal is going to be talking about which Topaz plugin is right for you. With the recent addition of Topaz ReStyle, we now have 14 products in our lineup, and sometimes we have some very versatile programs, but each program has its own strength. And Hal's going to be discussing how and demoing how he decides which plugin is correct for certain tasks. Hal is the director and lead instructor of LIGHT Photographic Workshops in Los Osos, California. He instructs all levels of photography, Lightroom, and Photoshop. His workshops and photo tours are recognized around the world as incredible learning experiences. I've heard all about them from some people that loved it. And his recently released Pocket Checklist is the ultimate photography field guide. So with that, I will go ahead and give it over to you, Hal.
All right, Nicole, thank you.
Absolutely. Should see that pop up.
All right, let me just take over the screen from you real quick, and we'll get moving.
Yes, I see the snake.
Probably a harsh way to start right there. So it's great to be back again with Topaz, and kind of the genesis of this webinar was I was recently down at a friend's house during a photography-related barbecue. And when we got to talking about the Topaz plugins, and one of the questions that someone had there for me was, you know, how there are a lot of plugins. And as Nicole just said, there are 14 different things that we have to choose from. And with that many options, which one do I use? I thought, you know what, that might be actually a pretty nice discussion for the webinar, and that's why I pitched over to Nicole, and she thought that would be a pretty good idea. So I think as some of the people have commented, although the title of this is which plugin is right for you, I think what you'll find with a lot of the plugins is that they work very well together. So really it's which plugins are you going to use and in what order. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to run things today from Photoshop. Now there are a lot of different ways we can do that. Of course you could launch that from the bridge initially. You might happen to be a Lightroom user. You might be using something standalone, and that's okay. Regardless of how you get there, it's going to be roughly the same workflow, and especially the same workflow once you get into the plugins themselves. The image I'm going to start with is just a shot of, well, actually it's a combination of shots. This is an Hdr Panorama in Morro Bay, California, down near where LIGHT is located, and where we run the California Photo Festival coming up here real soon. But this Hdr Panorama is, I think, a good illustration for us to discuss the initial portions of our plugins. Now, inside of Photoshop here, we always recommend to go through and start first by just duplicating that background layer, because that way it gives me the ability not only to use other tools in Photoshop such as opacity, blend modes, and masking, but it just keeps things a little more organized. So for right now, I'm just going to leave that as layer 1, and we're going to rename it in just a moment. So with that additional layer, let's take a look at the relatively extensive list of Topaz plugins that you have to choose from. Now I've got most everything on here, and some of them I use all the time, others not quite as much. Now looking through, when you're trying to figure out, all right, which of these am I going to use? Some are really just self-explanatory. For example, if I have an image with JPEG artifacts, I'm going to come in, I'm going to grab DJPEG, and that's going to be useful quite often if you have something when perhaps before you were shooting RAW, or if you had to shoot JPEG, it does a great job. For example, I recently did this on a client's image, and he had shot a JPEG and had a very banded sky. As a result of that JPEG, coming in, DJPEG took care of it real quickly, and we were able to make a big print out of it for him. Along the same lines, something also fairly self-explanatory, denoise. And denoise, although I say it's self-explanatory, that's one that might be a little bit confusing, because you'll find in some of the different plugins there are options for noise removal. And although there's a time and place to use those, the way we like to approach it is that if noise is a major problem in the underlying image, in that source, go straight to denoise. If the noise results as a process or part of the process of using a different plugin, then you can remove that noise in the plugin. And I'll show you more what I'm talking about when we look at Adjust in just a moment. So some of these are relatively self-explanatory. The DJPEG, denoise, we're going to go to those relatively quickly. Now, some aren't quite as self-explanatory, and they can be a little bit confusing. And what I'd like to do is use this example of the Hdr Panorama to show two of the most commonly used plugins, and two that I highly recommend everybody has. And they do something relatively similar, but they are very different plugins. And which ones I'm talking about here are Adjust as well as Clarity. And we get a lot of questions here at Light about those two because it seems like they're doing something almost the same. So what I'd like to do is start by launching Topaz Adjust. And our basic rule of thumb when choosing between these plugins is that Adjust, it does some amazing things to images. Now it's going to do that by adjusting detail and color and adaptive exposure and all sorts of great technology. But for me, the bottom line with Adjust is that it is somewhat of a special effect. And that's the way I like to approach Adjust. And I'll show you how we put that in practice here in just a little bit after we do the basic compare and contrast example. But for me, Adjust is more of a special effect, and that special effect is going to make an image that has impact. It has pop. It's got wow factor, but it might not necessarily be, really the most photorealistic effort. And that's okay because as photographic artists these days, we can really go any way we'd like, from as realistic as we want, all the way through something completely crazy and surreal. So Adjust for me tends to be a little bit more of a special effect. Looking at the basic layout, we're going to see this is common all day today. See, this is common all day, that everything is laid out basically the same. So over on the left, we've got our basic presets. We have content area in the middle, and then the individual adjustments as well as some additional navigational controls over on the right. So today I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the layout. Instead, we'll just use that as I typically would in a basic workflow. So when looking at Adjust, we have all of these incredible presets, and if you start moving through many of those, you're going to see that you get some relatively powerful and quick changes to your image. Things to watch out for in Adjust, because these changes are relatively quick and powerful, you do have possibilities where your dynamic range and the tonal range of your image can be pushed a little bit aggressively. Sometimes the saturation values can be, other times the detail level and contrast itself, and we can certainly go in and adjust all of that over here in the right panel. But as not an Adjust-centric webinar today, I'm not going to go into each of those. Instead, we'll just look at some of the basic presets. And for me, this one being an Hdr Panorama, one of the places that I love to go, looking over at my effect collections, is the Hdr Collection. And within that, I have some options where I can click through, make some pretty cool changes to my image. Always looking the before and after, just clicking on the image itself and then releasing the mouse. So I'm looking before right now, followed by the after. And I'll just grab one of these, perhaps one of the, like the medium pop grunge. Okay, that's a great little preset. I think it works awesome on HDR. And you'll see from the before here to the after, it really pops out. Makes some really good adjustments to the contrast, the saturation. There's a lot going on in this image now, much more so than there was before. Now you will see some places that you have some small haloing right up top here on the transition from the rock up into the clouds, and that's okay. We can deal with that a couple of different ways. You could either go over and modify your right panel, the individual controls, or we can take care of that in one of our other programs. So Adjust is pretty much, to me, a special effect. So I'm going to put that into our layer 1. I'm going to call it Adjust. And now we'd like to compare that with our Clarity option. Now, Adjust, as I explained a moment ago, at least in my thought, is that it's something that is somewhat of a special effect. Whereas the Clarity, and so I'm just going to duplicate that background again and call it Clarity as we're moving through this, so we can go back and forth between the two. So I'm going to come in and launch my Topaz Clarity. And Clarity, to me, although it's a very powerful effect, I tend not to think of it as a special effect. Instead, the Clarity adjustment, to me, tends to be something that is a little more natural. And that was one of the best things that I thought when Topaz introduced this, is that I had the ability to go in now and adjust contrast at 4 different levels, along with some of the underlying tonality of the image that might be adjusted by or might be modified by my contrast sliders, as well as some localized HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments. And we see all those, of course, over here on the right. But the basics of clarity, if you never go over here to the right, we are going to get a little bit more realistic effect. We have still impact and pop and wow factor, but it is more natural. I don't see quite as many halos or real transformation of the tonal range and the saturation and things like that. So I'm just going to grab maybe one of the presets over here. I'm looking in the Nature collection because I'm thinking it's kind of a natural setting, and I'm just looking through the natural boost and seeing that's given me just that little bit of a pop. We are seeing a little bit of change inside of the saturation levels, but all in all, it's a much subtler effect. Now, depending upon what I choose, I can easily go in and make that a little more heavy-handed, and that's over to you as to what level you want, but all in all, I find it to be a more natural effect, and that's what I use as really the discriminant when choosing between adjust and clarity. So I'll just grab one of the natural boosts here, and I'm going to go back over and hit OK, which will take this straight back over to Photoshop. Now, it can be a little bit challenging to see the difference of all of these, so I'm going to build a couple what are called layer comps real quick, just so that we can rapidly go back and forth to see the difference between the two. But there is our clarity, and then let's build one for our adjust layer. And within the adjust, as I had talked about earlier, we saw a little bit of haloing up top. So to keep that from really bothering me, what I'm going to do is just add a quick mask inside of Photoshop, and I'm going to apply a gradient to the mask. So I'd like to see all of that adjust effect in the foreground, and maybe not so much up here in the sky. So we'll put that little mask in there, and what that does is any place, if you're not familiar with masks, we'll make it real quick. Any place you're seeing white, it reveals the adjust effect. Any place you're seeing black, it conceals that. And the trick to get that, by the way, if you're a Photoshop player, that's Alt or Option. So Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac. Click onto your mask, and that's when you see just the mask itself. So inside of our basic document, I've got everything here. But over now, here's my adjust layer, and I can toggle that really quick to see the clarity. So we get to some place that is relatively similar, but just some subtle differences. As I click on that adjust, to me it's much more, and this is the adjust image you're looking at right now, to me that is a little bit more of a special effect, whereas the clarity slider, or the clarity adjustment, tends to be a little bit more natural. Now, in each of these cases, I've taken that adjust and the clarity layer, and I've left their opacity up at 100%, and I haven't changed any blend modes, but you do have the power to do that if you want to. So the first part of this, really, to me, what am I looking to do with the image? And that's how I can answer the question, what plugin am I going to use first? Now, if we approach this from an overall workflow perspective, what you may be asking is, well, when do you go to this step? And for me, coming into Photoshop or moving over into one of the plugins, I will typically do that once I'm finished with the basic workflow. And to me, the basic workflow as a RAW shooter, and honestly, even if I'm shooting JPEG or working on an older TIFF file, is that I'm going to go through either Lightroom's Develop module or Adobe Camera Raw's interface, and I will take care of the global and local adjustments that get me to a pretty good 95 to 98% solution for the image, and then it's time to push a little bit further into the plugins. Clarity. I use clarity when I want to keep things a little more realistic, a little more natural. I go in instead and use adjust when I want to push the boundaries. So you know what? I don't care if this necessarily looks perfectly realistic. I'm generating an image that has pop and it has impact. And it might bother my other photographer friends, but the people I show this image to are going to love it. And that's one of the things I think the more you play with some of the aggressive plugins, and it's not that I find Adjust to be an aggressive plugin, but you can make it so depending upon how you use your presets and apply the individual controls. But when you get a little more aggressive with that image optimization, a lot of your photographer friends might not necessarily like the image, but if you like it, that's good. And if your viewers like it, that is a really good thing to do. So I do this every time I'm teaching class, so I'll say it here today, especially as we're talking some cool plugins. I give you complete permission to do whatever you want with your pictures. Go absolutely crazy with them. Use Adjust to make something that has pop and wow factor. And if your photography buddies don't like it, so what? If you like it, and you love it, and the people you're showing it to and selling it to love it, keep going down that route. The beauty of digital is we can do whatever we want. And really, it matters to us, the photographic artist, whether we like what we're doing. So that's my basic flow with either Clarity or Adjust. And these are probably my two most commonly used plugins. With that discriminant, do I want a little bit more natural? Do I want to be a little bit more special effect? Now, from those three, or from those two, I go to my next, I guess, most commonly used plugin. And for that, I'm just going to build a quick composite layer. So that's got everything underneath it, and we'll use the Adjust one. Another plugin that is oftentimes thrown into this mix along with Adjust and Clarity is Detail. And Topaz Detail can do some of the same things. In fact, when you look at the Adjust interface, you're going to see some of the Detail sliders. Just like in Adjust, you might see some of the noise suppression sliders. But Detail, to me, is something that I'm going to use as a specific technique to go in and modify overall sharpening. And we could talk for days and days about sharpening and all the different options that are out there. But in general, at Light, we talked with 3 levels of sharpening. The first is input, which we do typically take care of inside of the raw converter. The second is called content sharpening. And then the third is output sharpening. When I want to go in and work some type of content sharpening, and what does that mean? That means I'm going to apply it to a master file. So it's size independent, but I want to adjust the edge contrast and the texture detail within the image. That's when Detail comes into play. Now on the opposite side of sharpening, when I want to output, and I'll show this process in just a little bit, there I'm thinking I need fine detail because I'm going to lose some fine detail when I push off to a projector or possibly to a printer, ink, and paper combination when I make a print. So the Detail plugin goes hand in hand with everything else, and I tend to use it after either Clarity or Adjust. And I'll use that detail to go in and accentuate specific details within the image. When I'm looking at content sharpening, it's more about shape and form. When I'm looking at output sharpening, it's more about fine detail. So this image here is not really one of the best ones to show that because it's already fairly detailed to begin with. So I'd like to just switch gears a little bit and look at a different image, applying the exact same thought process, and I would like to work through from the basic image itself, through most likely Clarity to keep it realistic, and then add a little bit of detail so we can build shape and form into the image. Now, the question that we always get when you're looking at Hdr Panorama, so I'm going to answer this right before we leave. An Hdr Panorama, folks always ask, they say, how do you stitch the individual panoramas together first and then do the HDR, or do you do the HDR and the individual components and then put it all together? Well, in most cases, it's going to be driven by what software you have. And the most commonly used software is typically the Adobe products. And the problem when you're using Photoshop to stitch panoramas, and Photoshop does a great job, but when you're using Photoshop to stitch panoramas, it doesn't always do it the exact same way. So if I looked first at the HDR pano and said, well, I have my overexposed panorama, and I can stitch that all together, and then my properly exposed and my underexposed, and you have maybe 3, 5, 7, or 9 different panos that you stitch first, the gotcha is that they're oftentimes stitched together very differently. So then when you go to merge the HDR process, you end up with ghosting based on the fact that the images really aren't in register. So if you're using the Adobe products, our recommendation at Light is to do the HDR process first for each of the components, and then once you have those processed in a similar manner, then stitch them all together, and you won't have any problems with that. Now when you do step up to a professional panorama program, something like Auto Panagiga Pro, that right there will do it the same way every time, so you don't have to worry about that, and you can really do it in any order when you step up to that software. So with that final discussion, I'm going to just get rid of that image and switch over to another panorama here, and this one is not in HDR. It's just a simple pano. that I was out with my wife Victoria last weekend, and we were driving up to Reno, Nevada, and we saw a great location and thought, you know what, we're going to take some scouting pictures here. And this is a scout panorama of a place called Red Rock State Park, and it is absolutely spectacular. Yeah, if you've never been there and you have the opportunity, go. It's not very big. It's really pretty cool. So I took this pano as just a basic, I want to demo, anybody who might go out there with me, here's the kind of stuff you're going to see. Now this is the pano as it's coming straight out of Photoshop. I will admit I have cropped it just a little bit, but where do we go from here? And I'm going to follow along exactly the same way we did before and show how I might use a series of Topaz plugins to accentuate or to take this image really where I want it to be. So when I look at this, I'm thinking that what I want here is some type of natural effect. And if I'm thinking natural effect, that leads me immediately towards clarity. So I've duplicated my background layer, I've called it clarity, and now we go in and launch that specific plugin. If my thought process was, hey, I want to make this totally surreal as an alien world, which you could easily do, then that would be I would select Adjust as opposed to Clarity. So inside of Topaz Clarity here, I'm going to see what it is I might want to do, and there's plenty of options. I think I'll come in and maybe take a look at, I'm going to go to Nature again. Now, I kind of like these nature boosts. And so when we look there, we give it a little before and after. These are going to be a little bit tougher to see. And what's cool about them being slightly tougher to see when you do the before and after with clarity is it shows you that most of these presets are somewhat gentle. They're somewhat natural. They're giving me a boost to the different levels of contrast, all the way from micro up to high contrast, but they're to some degree a little bit subtle. So I can do that, and I begin to build in a little bit of extra something into the image. So I'm going to try through here, looking again just a little bit more. And I find that these natural boosts inside of nature, they do a great job for me. They're a tremendous starting point. If we were talking specifically clarity, I would come over here and make some additional adjustments, which is also nice because I have that control. I've got a lot of presets, and then I have control if I want it. But here, just looking at the basic before and after, I like what I've done between these two. The only gotcha when I look at something inside of Clarity is, and I'd always like you to look at this micro contrast slider. And micro contrast does some amazing things. But there are times, and there are places in your images where micro contrast, you might not want to use too much of it. And for me, a place that I try not to use much micro contrast is up in the blue sky. So this blue sky, I don't want to have micro contrast applied up there. In fact, I'd really prefer not to have any of the contrast applied up there. Options that we have available, I could take this back to Photoshop or Photoshop Elements and do some masking, but with Clarity, I have such an impressive masking capability that I'll take care of that right here. When I'm looking at something like the sky, using Clarity, I'll just grab the color range option and drag my selection point up into the sky. And what you're looking at on the mask in the upper right, just like we saw before, any place you're looking at white, the adjust effect, the clarity effect is revealed. Any place you're looking at black, it is concealed. So I'll just go down into my color range options in the lower right. I'm going to increase the size of that color range selection. I'm going to decrease the sensitivity so it takes a little bit more of the sky until I get something looking like roughly like that. I'll have slightly applied clarity over here on the left. Probably not going to be a big deal. I'll reduce a little bit of the clarity applied down at the base of this cliff. Not a big deal. What was a concern to me was the sky. It's taken care of. And I could go in and hit OK if I wanted to. Since I'm here, though, one thing that this preset didn't do for me was I would like to see just a little bit more blue in that sky. And we can do that with our Hue Saturation and Luminance controls over on the right side of Clarity. So I'm going to do that real quick. And for those who have ever seen me talk about Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you know that I love the Hsl sliders. And I've always wanted them to be local, but they're not. Here inside of Clarity, they are local, because not only can I use these sliders, I have a masking capability. So what I like to use is something I call it's an instant polarizer trick. And this doesn't have anything to do with reflections or glare removal. Instead, when you use a polarizing filter, oftentimes with the sky, it tends to make things just slightly more saturated and a little darker. Well, we can do that exact same thing here inside of Clarity. I'm going to go to the saturation option. I'm going to kick up my blue saturation just a little bit. Skies are almost always a combination of blue and aqua, so I'm going to push that up a little bit as well. Now, I don't want to go too far because it's going to start looking truly fake and oversaturated. And there's times and places that's okay, but for this image, I'd like to keep it right about here. Now, the second half of the Instant Polarizer is go over to the luminance sliders. And in those, take your blue and aqua and pull them down just a little bit. And I like to do kind of an equal and opposite. So if I went saturation up 16 on each, or 0.16 on each, then on luminance I'll probably go down 0.16 on each. And now I have taken this image and give myself just a little pop in the sky. If it's too much, dial it back. Pretty easy. I just changed my sliders right over here. One thing that I am getting I really don't like as I'm doing this is right here in the shadow, I get a little accentuation of the blues, which means I can come down to my second mask and easily go in and paint this out. So I'll change my hardness down to 0 on the brush. And I want to remove that Hsl effect from the shadow, and also maybe from this little butte over here. Looking at this, I like where I've gone with Clarity, but I really wish I could make this just a hint brighter. And it turns out I can. If I go up to luminance, I'm going to kick up my orange luminance, because I'm thinking most of those rocks are kind of orange. So I can use that luminance to brighten up the face of the rock, even though it's in shadow. So I've made a fairly big adjustment here inside of Clarity, but it is all fairly realistic and natural. So that would be the way I'd go in, and as Clarity is processing this, and I put in the full resolution panel, so this is a pretty big file it's working on. But that to me is when I make the decision. Do I want to go realistic, or do I want to go something more special effect? Realistic pushes me into Clarity. I make my adjustments with the appropriate masks, and then I find myself here dropped right back into Photoshop. If you want to from this point, you could do more masking, you could do a little bit of opacity, you can do blend mode changes, completely over to you. Once I've made that, though, we were talking earlier about this concept of content sharpening. And content sharpening is something that we can use to build additional shape and form into our image. Now, shape and form is typically not going to be about the fine detail. It's something that's just a little bit larger than that, which is going to give us a guide as to how we would use the next Topaz plugin that fits in. And to me, it's one of my go-to 3, and that is Topaz Detail. So with an additional layer, I have it named Detail. I'm going to launch the Detail plugin. And we'll come right in here and use Detail through either a preset or just the basic sliders to increase the detail within the main rock on this image, and use that to build just a little more shape and form. So as Detail is analyzing this monstrous image, and it really is quite large. I think it was about 6 or 7 shots put together with a 20+ megapixel camera. It's analyzing that, and we find ourselves here ready to go. Now, when you're looking to do some type of content sharpening, which typically applies to a master file like this, I normally skip the small detail slider. Now, I could easily go in and use a preset, but I tend to, when using Detail, I go straight to the sliders. They're pretty simple to use. Look at what detail level do I want to affect. Small details, typically that is for input, output sharpening. Medium and large details, typically for content. So I'm looking here at a little bit of content sharpening, so I'm going to take my medium detail slider and push it up just a little bit. I give myself the befores and afters. It pushes it just a hint. I might try a little bit of that large detail in there as well. Now I've got definitely some shape and form built into the image. Now, one of the things that you're always going to want to do when working, especially on a file of this size, get in and look at this at a 1-to-1 view, because it's at that one-to-one view that we're really going to be able to see, okay, what's going on when I make an adjustment to each of the sliders. So I'm clicking, here is the before view. I'll give it just a second to get everybody caught up. And then release, there's the after. So I've used that detail slider to accentuate the shape and the form of the rock, giving it a little bit more of a 3D feel. When I'm satisfied with what I've done here, hey, pretty easy, I want to come out of detail. You might be asking yourself here, you know how, although it's medium and large details, you mentioned earlier you might not want to do that up here in the sky. And I agree with you, and I would do that here, but with detail, I find that the masking, it's not, well, I've become so spoiled with the clarity masking that if I had that, I'd do it right here, but I don't quite have the same level of fidelity, so I said okay, and I take it right back to Photoshop. Now, that would be one of my biggest things I would love from, and this will be my pitch to Nicole, is, well, if we could take those amazing new masking features and retroactively apply them, that'd be really cool. Now, they'll probably get rid of me after saying that, but clarity masking is so awesome. I absolutely love it. I'd really just about kill to have it fully inside of detail. But now that I'm back here with the with detail, it's showing me something a little bit odd, but I'm going to mask that out real quick. It's kind of odd that it was showing me that, but I'll just go in Photoshop real fast and mask this detail out. That way I can put this only onto the rock, which builds in that beautiful shape and form into the image. Once again, hold down that alter option so I can see where everything is. And looking at my overall before and after, so my image started here. I like where it is, but then once I've applied my clarity and detail, I mean, I really pop, yet I keep the overall realistic feeling of what was there. When I was looking at this, I was impressed by how amazingly textured and just unreal everything was here on the rock face. So that's what I'm getting now out of this. Clarity followed by detail for the shape and form. From here, you can really go any place you like. Looking at other potential plugins, if I build another layer here, anytime I look at something like this, it is so simple going in and making a black and white interpretation. I love the cool of the sky, I love the warm of the rock, but what would it look like as a black and white? Well, pretty easy to figure out. Why? Because we've got access to going into our next plugin, which would be black and white effects too. Now, I've just created another layer for that. I hit the plugin, and it's going to do, to me, a spectacular black and white interpretation. Let's bring it up. Now that one right there might not be exactly what I'm looking for, but I'll drop into some of my favorites. I can see, you know what, if I wanted to make a quick black and white interpretation of this, I certainly could. So I won't go through all of the controls here inside of black and white effects, but I will tell you that I really like black and white effects too. And it's oftentimes compared with another product that's out there, and I won't say too much negative about that other than the fact that you will get a substantially, it's a much better conversion when using Topaz black and white effects too, because the processing behind the scenes does not leave you any artifacts or banding or posterization. This is a great way to go about your black and white conversions. So real quick, I know I don't have a huge amount of time in these webinars. I could talk all day about this stuff, but for me, what plugins are we looking at there? Hey, let's use clarity so that we can build in a realistic adjustment to the contrast, followed by detail to build shape and form, that content sharpening concept. And then finally, a black and white interpretation that maybe I use, maybe I don't. The beauty of it is that I get a high quality black and white interpretation of the image, and it's easy to do. If I'm just using a preset, or maybe something, maybe one of the other sliders, you know, it doesn't really matter. I can always get there. Now, just because we're here, one of the things that I do find a little bit annoying about this image is the fact that this little cloud in the upper right is out of position. So just real quick, I want to take care of that and show you a quick way to do it. So I'm going to grab a lasso tool inside of Photoshop and just circle this little guy. And I'm going to copy and paste that to its own layer. I'm going to call it a cloud. And then I'll go back to my composite layer here. And I'm going to grab something like the, I don't know, the patch tool. And you can use any of your retouch tools that you would want, but I'm going to take that and remove the cloud from the image because it kind of bothered me there. And then I'll go back to my cloud layer and move this over a little bit because I think the cloud should go right about here. That just seems more balanced to me. Now you notice I didn't make any kind of crazy selection. Instead, if you've ever seen me on these discussions, you know that I'm a blend mode fanatic. And one of the easiest ways to move a cloud around in the image is just to go up and take that blend mode and go from normal down to lighten, and there we go. So for me, combination of 3, maybe 4 different Topaz plugins gets me where I want to be on this image. So let's push ahead and see what other things we could do. I won't go through and do all of this image here. Interestingly shot just north of Topaz's offices in Texas. An awesome, here's my gratuitous plug, an awesome Hdr workshop. I'll be back down there in Addison again in November, photographing more birds. But looking at this, you know, if I wanted to do a realistic interpretation, I would do the exact same thing. Clarity followed by detail and then anything else. If I wanted to go a little crazy, I'd push it to adjust. Seems already you've seen that big example though. I won't do it. In fact, we'll switch gears a little bit. And coming back to the bridge, I want to show you a couple of the other plugins that I like to use. Oftentimes when you're making a logo, and we make some logos every now and again, and we make posters for different folks, when you look at a straight-up image, it can be a little bit too detailed. So if you see this eagle here that's on screen, notice it's been cleaned up just a little bit. And I've taken away a lot of that detail and I've left with something that's a little more illustrative. And that illustrative effect that we use quite often around here is actually a result of using Topaz Clean. And it's not one that I hear folks use too often, but I think it's a pretty slick little plugin. And so I'd like to just show you how we use that. And I'm going to bring up a picture of what I call a rainforest eagle. This is up on one of our Alaska tours. And I'll name that Clean. And I want to show you the effect that I'm going to use on a different image in just a moment. But I'll come down to my Topaz Labs filters. For this one here, I'm not going to use clarity. I'm not going to use detail. I probably would in real life, but we've already shown those. Not going to use adjust, but I'll come in here to clean. And when you launch clean, what it really does is goes in and it cleans up the image in terms of it removes some of the detail and replaces it with other cool stuff. Now, one of the ones that I really love to use, it might just be me, but many people tend to like it. If you happen to have an iPhone, there's a little app called Tangled, and the Tangled app does something really similar to this. But what you can do is, as you make your adjustments to the image, you can begin to really clean this up quite a bit. And if you notice what you're getting here inside of this bird, is that he tends to be a little bit, you get some of these nice little curly edges there, and it tends to look more like an illustration than it does a photograph. So if you ever need to go in and you're looking at an image and say, I need to turn this into something a little more illustrative, look towards Topaz Clean, possibly Topaz Simplify, although I find myself using Clean a little bit more often. So when we look at what Clean can do, I'm not going to go through all of the different options there, but looking at Clean, that's what we use to make this Alpha Strike logo. It's an eagle we shot in Alaska. We'll use it for the inkjet paper company we run here out of Light, and that simple clean effect, along with the black and white conversion in black and white effects, gets me something really nice. So where is it that I would use that in another location? Doing it relatively quick, we were asked recently to make a poster for a winery. So I went out into their vineyard and shot the Milky Way late at night and ended up with, ultimately this is where we ended up, but where we started was something along these lines. And when you look in at this image, and it was a little bit noisy and a little bit busy, so I thought, you know what might be a great idea here is I'll go in and use Topaz Clean and clean it up a little bit. So I'll drop into Topaz Labs, pick up Clean just like we did before. That moves me right into a one-to-one view. And I can come in now and modify all the settings here, and I'll just go through relatively quick. You can have plenty of time to go in and play around with these, but they do some pretty cool things. And so I'll go in and modify all of the different options here, and what I'm looking to get is just this nice little curly Q effect in the image. That way it cleans it up just a little bit, and it's going to serve as a great foundation for going in and becoming the basis of this poster. Now after I cleaned this, and the image is looking okay, I'll be honest, I found myself a little bit confused as to where I want to go next. And when I find myself liking what's going on in an image, but confused as to what the next step is, that to me leads to another Topaz plugin, and that is ReStyle. When am I going to use ReStyle? ReStyle gives me 1,000 presets that will expand my creativity. Because I'll be honest, I'm not a very creative guy, but if I get an image to a point that I like, and I want to know, well, where can it go? Topaz has already thought about that for me. So I've got a different layer. I'll come into Filter, this time drop down into Topaz Labs again and choose ReStyle. And inside of ReStyle now, I'm going to be given access to a huge number of presets that I can go in and make some adjustments to the image. Now there are, I forget what the current count is, Nicole, but it's over 1,000 different presets that we have available. And this allows me to go in and really see what is possible with my image. I can adjust tonal range, contrast, color palette, all of this stuff, and I'll be honest, I really don't have to think about it too much because everything is there inside of these presets, and I can go from one to the other and relatively quickly map the new tones and colors, or if I click into the grid view, I can go through and see everything that might be possible with all of the thousands of presets. I know for this one that I used something called Blue Iced Dawn in the seascape, and it very quickly took my night image, which I liked, and turned it into a little bit better background for my winery poster. ReStyle, when I initially saw it, I was like, I'm not so sold on this. But the more I played with it, and it only took about 30 to 45 minutes, I completely fell in love with it because it allowed me to explore the creative possibilities in an image that I probably wouldn't have thought of my own. So on this image, boy, I just hit OK. And for some reason I don't have a key on this one, so we won't be able to fully see it. But it gives you all of these incredible options to make changes to your image. It is really, really cool stuff. But that became the foundation for, as we said before, this winery poster right here, a result of Topaz Clean, Topaz ReStyle, just a little bit of Photoshop to drop the text in, and that's where we are. So to me, it was absolutely Topaz Festival to get that process finished. I would like to show you one other thing that I absolutely love in Topaz ReStyle. I probably don't have a huge amount of time left here, although I would love to talk to you all day. I'm going to bring up a shot that we did relatively recently. And this is another one where I consider the image almost finished. But although it was finished, it wasn't quite where I wanted it to be. And I know I wanted to go somewhere with it, but I didn't know where. And whenever I find myself in that position, I think Topaz ReStyle. So I can come in, I can go through ReStyle, and ReStyle will figure out for me all of the different possibilities. So we'll launch that again real quick, and I'll show you almost my favorite feature inside of ReStyle. For this one, I'm going to come up into the fashion options. And inside of the fashion options, there are so many here. I'm just going to launch the basic grid view and move through all of these. And just kind of take a look and see if there's something that I really like out of this. Now, a way to look at these effects are, and I heard this, I can't remember exactly which photographer told me, but these are what you might consider charge more money effects. Things that people you're doing a photograph for, or potentially a client, the effect itself, it looks like it was really hard to do. But ReStyle has made it simple. But the effects are so incredibly cool that you can charge a little bit more money for this because it's something slightly out of the ordinary, a little bit different. Now, I applied this basic bleached silver to the image, and I'd feel very remiss if I didn't come up and show you that one of the things that we can do inside of ReStyle, and I've moved my cursor over here to the right side, is that we have access to blend modes. And I told you before, I'm kind of a blend mode fanatic. And I can go through and see, okay, is there a particular blend mode that's going to make this work a little better? You know, there's some stuff in here that I absolutely love. So maybe I'll come in, turn that basic silver. Let me show you that's where it was. Then I go in and click it over to overlay mode, and I go from here to here. High contrast, really amp it up, smooths out the skin beautifully just by the tonality, and I'm ready to go there. I've got my charge more money effect, or if I wanted to, I could go choose any of the 900 others that might apply to this image. If I've got the time, Nicole, if I could just do like one more quick one just for giggles. I said before, Adjust is a special effect. And oftentimes we think special effects don't necessarily apply to people. But here's a shot that we did a couple of years ago as a promotion for a winery up here. And I just want to show the basics of this, because we can go into something like Adjust on a simple model shot and really start to kick this up. And to give you the flavor for the ways you might do this, I'm going to launch Adjust. And I'm going to come into, my stylized collections, which are pretty aggressive. And I'll do something like this, which you might be looking at this and saying, how, you know what, that does not work. The before works and the after doesn't necessarily. But try this out. And I'll hit OK, and it'll apply this. And then what I like to do when I do something relatively crazy like that is I'll go back in and take the Adjust, my special effect, and then put it into Luminosity Mode. And that Luminosity Mode, and I just want to zoom in right here into the metals and the side of this jacket, and you can really see that, look at the three-dimensional nature that we got out of that Adjust special effect and changing the blend mode. Now that really didn't work up here on the face, but what works beautifully on smoothing faces? Well, how about Topaz Clarity? So if you're looking to smooth skin, go to the filter, Topaz Labs will launch Clarity. And before, we tended to be boosting the clarity to get a specific pop. But for this one, I'll drop into Fashion. I'll go to Studio One. That smooths the skin beautifully for me. I can go to my Hsl filters, brighten the skin a little bit more with the orange luminance. Hit OK. And the process here was that I take the special effect from Adjust, use that for everything but the skin, and then my beautiful skin that I have from Clarity, I'll paint that in. So ultimately we get a combination of the very aggressively three-dimensional grungy jacket with the beautiful soft skin that we get from Clarity. So there are so many possibilities using these Topaz plugins. We could talk about this really forever if Nicole let me. I know we're out of time there, so I'll stop here. But hopefully that gives a basic flavor as to what it is you can do with Topaz plugins and why you might choose one or the other. So with that, Nicole, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions that folks might have.
Thank you so much. That was awesome, very comprehensive, so people are really enjoying it. Give me 1 second, and I'll pull up some of the questions that I've saved. And then if you guys have any more questions, we have Hal for about 10 more minutes, and then I will go ahead and announce the winner of the complete Topaz collection and the coupon codes. But let's see what questions we have.
All right.
All right. Okay, going back to your first workflow with the Hdr Panorama.
Sure.
Ian had asked what your workflow for creating an Hdr Panorama. Do you stitch exposure brackets, then HDR process, or process each bracket, then stitch? And I think you went over this, but just in case anybody missed it.
You know, that question oftentimes comes up, and it's really a matter of what software you have. So let me bring up that HDR Pano again. And this one here was, I think, just a basic. For every segment there were 3 shots, so you're on, under, over. There's probably roughly 2 stops, because I think I did with just a basic Canon camera a few years ago. And there are probably 6 segments moving from left to right. Now, if you're working Photoshop, Photoshop Elements, Panomaker Pro, any of those pieces of software to do your panorama, our recommendation at Light is to do the HDR process first. So go to each of the segments, merge those images together, do your HDR processing the same on each of them, and then once you have those resultant tone map TIFFs, regardless of the software you're using, take those TIFFs and then stitch them together to create your panorama. If you're working with some type of truly professional panorama making software such as AutoPan at Giga, there you can do each individual and then blend together, because that pan of software will blend the same each time. So hopefully that kind of that gives at least a flavor for where you need to go with those HDR panos.
Fantastic. All right, Diane had asked if you use Detail as the last plugin in your workflow for sharpening.
Could you say that one again, Nicole? Sorry.
If you use Detail as the last plugin in your workflow?
You know, I typically do. Yeah, I typically do, and for that, let me just launch up another image real quick. And the output process, when we do an output workflow here at Light, we typically start by setting the aspect ratio of the image, and then we'll size the image appropriately for the specific media that it's going to, or medium that it's going to. And once we get there, we know that necessary evil of our photography life is sharpening, because we're going to lose a little dynamic range. We're going to have a little dot gain, and anything that I push out to a paper is going to appear to be a little bit softer than what I have on the screen. So with the output sharpening, you got a lot of different ways to do that, but really we have found one of the absolute best is using Topaz Detail. So for my output workflow, I've got this image sized at a 4:5 ratio. I would drop into my image size dialog box. Let's just say we're going to put this on, oh, I don't know, we'll call it a 16:20. To me, I'm using a native resolution resizing option. It goes a little bit beyond our discussion here, but that leaves me with an input resolution of the printer of just over 200 pixels per inch, which for us works. I will hit OK, and then the next step is to do that output sharpening, and I will do it via Topaz Detail. And as I bring up that plugin, what I didn't really talk about with the there's the one I want, with the detail earlier, is that output sharpening is always about the fine details. And anything that's about fine details to me tells me that I can ignore a majority of what's going on in the right panel of detail, except for the small detail slider. So I'll go in and zoom into either, usually about 50% is our assessment position, and then I'll take that small detail slider and just pump it up slightly so that I can just notice a difference as I'm clicking the effect on and off. Now, using Detail for output sharpening, it still means you need to follow the 2 golden rules of sharpening. And the first golden rule of sharpening is that if in doubt, under sharpen. So if you find yourself moving that small detail slider, and you're like, boy, I don't know, should I add more, should I add less? Always go with less. Images don't get ruined by being slightly under sharpened, but a lot of images have major problems because they are over sharpened. So we find that just right level, and once you have it, you can hit OK, and then that takes us to the next golden rule of sharpening, which is all sharpening should be targeted. That is, sharpening doesn't apply everywhere in the image. I don't need to do output sharpening on things that aren't my primary subject, otherwise they might pull attention away from, in this example, my eagle and my crow. So I would go in and use some type of masking discussion or some type of masking workflow to apply this detail only to my primary subjects. And I think, as I'm going in the Wayback Machine, Nicole, I think one of the webinars that y'all have recorded on Detail from a few years ago has that exact process of how you would create a very detailed mask.
Yes.
But for me, that is almost always the last step in the workflow, with the one big caveat that final output sharpening applies to output files, and it does not apply to what I would consider my master file.
Perfect.
So hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, it definitely does. This next question, I know that you could go into this for much longer than just a couple minutes, but I think it's a good question if you have a couple tips for him. Brad had asked, or first he says great info, but his question is about printing. He often finds that once I'm finished making my adjustments, I print my photo and it doesn't look like I thought. What is the best way to overcome this? And I know that's a kind of a loaded question, but if you can give some tips,
kind of a loaded question, but I'll tell you there are a couple things that we could talk to real quickly. The first of those is that if you're interested in printing, make sure you're working on a color managed process where you've profiled your devices. So primarily I've gone and I've profiled my monitor. Whenever I output to the printer, I'm making sure that I have a strong profile. And that keeps the color as consistent as possible. Now when you talk in printing, you typically look to something, the end state, at least that we talk about, is something called WYSI whip, or what you see is what you print. And that's kind of the goal of, I'd like my print to be relatively close to the monitor, at least as close as it can be. Now you'll have to remember that it's never going to be exactly the same, because we're looking at a backlit, really illuminated monitor, and then we have a reflective type piece of paper. But with that, you can still make it very, very close. If you're on a color managed profiled system, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say the number one thing that goes wrong in profiling a monitor is not knocking down the brightness level. So many monitors that people are using to work on their digital photographs are way too bright. Really what you want to target when you look at your brightness settings, our recommendation at Light, get down there somewhere around 80 or 90, and that is going to be something a little more realistic. Now, with a color managed system, you need to take care of the file. And taking care of the file for me means give yourself a good tonal range. Push that tonal range as wide as possible, close to black, close to white. Do all of these adjustments and really give yourself a finished master file. I think so many folks look at the image on the monitor and say, you know, that's exactly what I want. And then when it goes over to the printer, it's kind of blah. And the typical fix is looking back at the image critically, you find that the tonal range isn't as wide as it should be. You haven't taken the time to do the content sharpening, the adjustments to clarity across the image, the targeted non-destructive dodge and burn. All of these little tips and tricks that folks used to do in the darkroom, we still have to do those when working digitally. So we could talk printing, Nicole, for probably hours, but work on a profiled system, so use color management, and then look at the tonal range and all of the small adjustments on your image, and you should get pretty close.
Thank you so much, Hal. This has been an incredible session. Everybody has been given some great feedback and really appreciated your very comprehensive covering of all the plugins. So thank you.
You're certainly welcome.
All right, everybody, have a great evening or morning or afternoon wherever you are, and we'll be talking to you soon. Bye, everyone.